Hello, fellow Bible geeks. Hi, Ryan Schumacher here, and we are on week 3 of our study of Tom Wright's Surprised by Hope. And this week we're talking about the resurrection. So we've been going through the series of 6 weeks as part of this study, and I encourage you, if you haven't, to go back and go through weeks 1 and 2. We're really starting to set the stage for what's coming later. Weeks 1 and 2, we talked about what the Bible really has to say about heaven, what the Bible really has to say about hell. If you think you know the answer to those things, then you should probably go watch weeks 1 and 2, because the topic of the book Surprised by Hope is about how much of what's in the Bible is really kind of a surprise. And so as a necessary foundation, I think, to the discussions that we're going to be having in the coming weeks, I would go look at that as a foundation. But today now we're starting to get into the real substance of Christian hope. And it's not heaven, it's not hell, it's resurrection. It's the coming and returning of Jesus. It's the final judgment, actually, is part of our hope. We'll get to that. That'll be kind of fun. And then week 6, the kingdom of God and what it means, both in the future as well as what it means today. So today's topics, we're going to be talking about resurrection. We're going to go over pagan and Jewish views of resurrection. We're then going to talk about what actually happened, the surprising resurrection of Jesus. And we'll get into a little bit of apologetics there, because the resurrection of Jesus is not a just kind of, some people can believe it, some people cannot. The Bible does not leave that open to us. If there's something that you've got to be willing as a Christian to be held to account for, it's that the resurrection actually happened. If you're willing to forfeit that, if you're willing to fold and not defend the resurrection, you might as well just give it up and not pretend that you're really any sort of Christian, to be totally honest. And not my words, St. Paul's words. So, excuse me. We're then going to get into what the resurrection means, both in terms of our long-term hope, and then we'll talk about what it means for us today. So I'm going to start off here by talking about the views on resurrection, pagan and Jewish. The reason I want to start here is sort of a long, slow burn kind of argument, or a slow boil, slow cook, whatever you want to call it, argument on that we'll get to in the second part, about how resurrection is not the way that people thought. We have this idea that because we are sophisticated, post-Enlightenment, Western people in the 21st century, who use science. Some people do use science. A lot of people use science. We know that people don't come back from the dead. And I promise you, we've figured that out well before the 17th century. That was probably figured out closer to the 17th century BC than the 17th century AD in England. So we need to understand that ancient people were not unsophisticated. We need to understand what their views were, and it's through this background that the surprise of the resurrection really comes forward, because it was just as much of a surprise then as it would be today. I guarantee you. So let's get into this, the pagan and Jewish views on resurrection. I think it's summed up pretty nicely in this headstone here. The headstone, and you can kind of see it right here. So non fui memini, non sum, non curo. And if you're unfamiliar, in Latin, the V's are the U's for us in English. So the sounds that they rendered with the V letter are the sounds that we render with the U letter. So what does that mean? I was not, I was. Memini would be I had memories. This is not really part of the standard formulation of the statement, but it appears on this tombstone here. So I was not, I was. I am no more, I do not care. That's pretty much what they thought. I wasn't born, then I was. I had memories, I remembered. I am no more, I don't care. This pretty much sums up their view of the afterlife, or resurrection. You died and that was it. The lights go off, fade to black. All right, thanks for coming, everyone. And you strike the set, and it's all over. Nothing ever happens again. So truly just things end, and shrug. That's it. And that was on their tombstone. And this was actually popular enough that even on some tombstones, I'm told, it was just abbreviated. People knew that phrase. Thinking like, may the force be with you is a phrase that we all know. It was idiomatic. Like people just knew what that meant. And so you could abbreviate it. So that was their view on what happened to you after you died. You stayed dead. This showed up in their literature too. So the road to Hades was a one-way street. When Odysseus in the Odyssey visited Hades, he confronted the shades of the veterans of the Trojan War, shades being the ghosts. Ajax, Agamemnon, Achilles, they're vaporous creatures, and they're positively miserable. And they weren't coming back. They weren't capable of coming back. They didn't have bodies. They were just ghosts, shadows, shades, whatever you want to call them. Also, the tale of Orpheus and Eurydice. If you're familiar with that, Orpheus and Eurydice really like each other. Eurydice dies, goes to the underworld. Orpheus, I'm going to go bring her back and rescue her. Orpheus goes down there, and he's told that he could bring Eurydice back if he could make it to the exit of the underworld without turning around and looking at her before he gets to, before they both exit the underworld. Well, they get up there, he gets out, he doesn't wait for her to get out, he turns around, and she descends back to the underworld forever. The fact of the matter is, nowhere in their literature did they have this idea that people could return from the underworld. So whether it's in their tombstones or in their literature, they just never thought about bodies coming back to life. That was not within their consciousness. Lucretius, you may have heard of him before. De Rerum Natura, The Nature of Things. It's a poem. He wrote metaphysics in a poem. So philosophy through poetry. It's a rather elegant, something that they did back then. We don't do that too much today. But he's thought of as being one of the primary articulations of a philosophy called Epicureanism. You would have like Epicureanism, Stoicism, and then along the side too, hedonism as the three dominant ways of thinking. So in Paul in Acts chapter 17 encounters the Stoics and the Epicureans. Hedonism, you might have heard of that before. That's just, live for pleasure, whatever. Relatively simple. For Lucretius, he wrote down, and this is a very long section. I could have picked from pages to articulate this point of view, but it worked out pretty well just to pick this one. He says, why then doubt that soul once without the body thrust there in the open, an enfeebled thing, its wrappings stripped away, so the wrappings for the soul, cannot endure, not even through no everlasting age, but even indeed through not the least of time. He's basically saying, why doubt that when the soul is without the body, when its wrappings are stripped away, it cannot endure, not into an everlasting age, not through even a bit, the least of time. This was the view of the Epicureans, that when your body died, your soul, whatever, the Stoics believed more in the soul. That you had Platonism. The Epicureans were like, meh. Like the soul is just a description of the animating force in the body. When the body's dead, there's no continuity of existence. Nothing exists beyond you. So they were so confounded by Paul's preaching in Athens in Acts chapter 17 that they thought that he was preaching about a god, Jesus, and the goddess, Anastasis, the word resurrection. So from where, if you know the name Anastasia, Anastasis, the Greek word for resurrection, and they couldn't get their heads around what he's saying, that they were saying he seems to be proclaiming foreign divinities, foreign deities, plural. And then Luke's comment in Acts is that since he was preaching about Jesus and the resurrection. So he's talking, what's this guy saying? Oh, it's foreign gods. And then Luke's comment is because he was preaching about Jesus and Anastasis. Actually, if I look at Tom Wright's Kingdom New Testament, his personal translation, the think what it says in here. Oh, it's on the next page. Whoops, I can't looking at the wrong. Yeah, he seemed to be proclaiming foreign divinities declared others since he was preaching Jesus and anastasis. Anastasis means resurrection. So they took him to the Areopagus. And so this is when Paul's famous speech in Acts chapter 17 comes up, his sermon amongst the Athenian philosophers. And he gets a long way in this sermon. And once he mentions resurrection, then when they heard about the resurrection of the dead, verse 32, some of them ridiculed Paul. He gets interrupted. They're willing to sit through him talking about Jesus. They're willing to sit through him talking about how Jesus was before all things and he's the creator of the universe and you have this unknown God, but I'm preaching this unknown God to you. And they're sitting through and, they're probably not digging it, but when he mentions resurrection, that's when they're done. They're like, they interrupt and they ridicule him at that point. That was their view of the idea of resurrection. The Epicureans didn't believe the resurrection. The Stoics, oddly enough, believed in the soul surviving death. And so there were some who said, we will hear more from you. And even though it doesn't say it, these are more likely to be the Stoics than the Epicureans. So, quick summary. Some people believed in eternal life. Believed in the eternal soul, the Stoics. This would be following kind of Plato's philosophy. Some believed in annihilation, the Epicureans. Nobody believed the dead came back in bodily form. The dead stayed dead. That's how this works. And when you're in the ancient world and people are dying all the time, disease, famine, infection, war, you know darn well the dead people are dead. They encounter death so much more in the ancient world than we encounter it today. So don't patronize ancient people by saying, oh, they're just superstitious and they believe everything. They know way more about death than you did. Unless you happen to have like a close loved one who's passed away, then you pretty much darn well know that that's how it happens. So they were just observing the world around them. Dead stayed dead, and that's what they believed. I was not, I was, I am no more, I do not care. The Jewish view is different than that, but maybe not as different as you'd think. So in Isaiah 25, there's a few statements in the Old Testament that get at this. So he, Yahweh, this is Isaiah 25. This is an eschatological vision. This is talking about the ultimate restoration of Israel. He will swallow up death forever. And then the Lord God will wipe away the tears from all the faces, and the disgrace of his people he would take away from the earth. So death will be swallowed up. You might recognize that from 1 Corinthians 15 as well. And then in the next chapter, Isaiah chapter 26, your dead shall live, their corpses shall rise. O dwellers in the dust, awake and sing for joy, for your dew is a radiant dew, and the earth will give birth to those long dead. So here we have in Isaiah, this is the pre-exilic part of Isaiah. So this is relatively early on. There's a beginning of a development after the establishment of the Davidic monarchy. You have the temple in place. You have Hezekiah not too far off. There's this prophetic oracle about the resurrection of the dead. You would say this is the first time in the Hebrew Bible that this idea of the resurrection really comes front and center. Also, dwellers in the dust, think Sheol. Those people shall awake. Probably the clearest one is in Daniel chapter 12. So many of those who sleep in the dust. Now, we're changing scenes here. This is in the Babylonian exile. So this is probably a few hundred years later than what we saw with Isaiah chapter 26. Isaiah has multiple parts. You'd have, I would call it like the pre-exilic, the exilic, and the post-exilic. But 1 through 39 generally thought of as pre-exilic, unless you take sort of a revisionist view on the history. But Orthodoxy tends to regard 1 through 39 as pre-exile, and then 40 through 55 as exilic, and then afterwards as the return from exile. Daniel chapter 12 plants you, firmly in the exile. As Daniel's one of the exilic prophets. He's talking to Nebuchadnezzar, himself. But at the very end of the book, you have this statement: so many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise shall shine like brightness of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. So here's another statement of resurrection. So together, these things comprise, I'm going to call it a faint view of resurrection among the Jewish people. This is pretty much what you get in the Old Testament. I'm sure people have done more in-depth studies on this and could probably quote a few more verses. But I would say, it's kind of in the background. It's not the major focus of the Old Testament. It is much more about the relationship between the Israelites and the God of Israel. So, here we go. There was even some dispute about whether or not this resurrection teaching really even should be regarded as true. So you've heard about, probably if you spent some time in the Gospels, that there were the Pharisees who believed in the resurrection, the Sadducees who did not. Just a quick side note, most Jews in Jesus' day would have identified themselves with Pharisaic Judaism. We can sometimes think of them as like separate people. Like there were some Pharisees, and the Pharisees were only the religious teachers, and then there were the Sadducees, and then there was everybody. Think of it like calling yourself a Democrat or a Republican. There are party operatives. There are Republican congressmen and Democratic senators and governors and members of the party apparatus. And that's probably the kind of people, when the Bible talks about the Pharisees, that's probably more of those functionaries that it's talking about. But you'll have like 50% of the country that will identify themselves. Maybe not 50%, it's more like 40% are going to identify with the Democrats and 40% are going to identify with the Republicans. And then you've got the messy middle for the rest of them. But just think of it that way. That the Pharisees are not just a few people in authority. So the Sadducees, who didn't believe in the resurrection, their argument was relatively simple. They had a Torah primary view. If it's in the books of Moses, true. If it's not in the books of Moses, meh. And they are right to point out that the resurrection is not mentioned in the Torah. Again, I'm sure somebody has written a paper on the resurrection being in the Torah. I'm not aware of it. It is certainly not straightforwardly there. So the relevance of this, though, I think is debatable. Like, why would it matter? But that was their presupposition. They were probably afraid in some sense of motivating a cult of the dead and drifting towards pagan worship. That at least is probably what they would have said. This was, the pagan worship got you towards Moloch worship. Moloch, there was some worship of death going on in there. So there's, that's the charitable view. Tom Wright in The Resurrection of the Son of God has a bit of a not so charitable view of the Sadducees, and he points out something that's going to be relevant to us later. So the real problem for the Sadducees, in his opinion, was that the resurrection from the beginning was a revolutionary doctrine. The Sadducees realized that such beliefs threatened their own position. People who believe that their God is about to make a new world and that those who die in loyalty to him in the meantime will rise again to share gloriously in it are far more likely to lose respect for a wealthy aristocracy than people who think that this life, the world, and this age are the only ones that will ever be. Sadducees being the ones that he's discussing as the wealthy aristocracy. So take it as you will. But that, if you wondered about the Sadducees and the Pharisees and what the disagreement was about, there it is. I think what eventually developed ends up being, if there's one image that reflects the view of resurrection of the Jews at Jesus' time, it's probably this. It's probably not from the biblical text, but from the Apocrypha, 2nd and 4th Maccabees, relaying the story of the woman and her 7 sons, the 7 Maccabean martyrs. So, and this is a painting here by Cesare showing, you can see the dead bodies of some young men on the ground, and then this woman in the middle who has her arms raised to the sky. So this painting is capturing the scene from 2 Maccabees 7, where Antiochus IV, the Seleucid king, had captured them and tried to get them to eat pork. Like that's, and really, and I think he's the guy who's up here. Really what he's trying to get them to do is to go against their principles. And the mother is encouraging her sons to hold steadfast, keep Torah, and die the death of a martyr rather than to deny Yahweh and their covenant. And you can see in the statements of the sons, I've picked out two of them, but you have a few of the sons who are articulating a very clear view of resurrection. So the second son, when he was at his last breath, he said to the king, "You accursed wretch, you dismiss us from this present life, but the King of the universe will raise us up to an everlasting renewal of life, because we have died for his laws." And then the next son, after him, the third was the victim of their sport. When it was demanded, he quickly put out his tongue and courageously stretched forth his hands. They were going to cut them out. And he said nobly, "I got these from heaven, and because of his laws I disdain them, and from him I hope to get them back again." So that's interesting right there. I got these from him. I disdain them. I regard my body as less important than Yahweh. And I believe that I will get these back again. That's when you combine that with the previous one about he will raise us up to an everlasting renewal of life because we have died for his laws. There's this bodily resurrection idea. So, and this seems to be playing on the Daniel chapter 12 idea that there will be a resurrection, some to righteousness. And then specifically we have the bodily idea put in here. Something they could agree on, though, they definitely didn't believe in a crucified and risen Messiah. That was not part of the game plan. 2 Samuel 7 does not describe the death or resurrection of David's son. That's where the idea of the Messiah comes from. And you can see that play out with Jesus' followers. So as they were coming down the mountain, this is in the Transfiguration. He makes a statement about his impending death. So he ordered them to tell no one about what they'd seen at the Transfiguration until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. And notice what happens here. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead could mean. So they had, just ponder this for a second. They'd just seen the Transfiguration. And he's talking about, so he's up there glorified. There's Moses and Elijah and then Jesus, this dramatic scene. And he says, tell no one until the Son of Man is risen from the dead. If this was part of their understanding of what was supposed to happen with the Messiah, don't you think that this would have made them really excited? That they would have been like, yes, finally, that's it. He's here, the one who's going to die and rise again. We learned about this in Sunday school. No, that's not what happened. The text says the opposite. Even despite the fact that they're pretty sure that he's the Messiah, the one sent from God, this whole it's so contrary to their view. They're like, huh? Wait, but you're supposed to be the, eternal ruler, sit on the throne forever. We're supposed to get, the Shekinah glory is going to return. We're going to be in right relationship with God again. We're going to have our kingdom. We're going to have our king. It's going to be you. No part of that story involved death. So it's important to understand that going into this was contrary to their expectations. The general resurrection was the expectation for most, if not all. And Martha in John 11 articulates this. At the death of Lazarus, Martha says to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." And Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." That's the idea. There will be a resurrection on the last day. He will rise again. Like the Maccabean martyrs, the righteous will rise again, just like Daniel said, just like we see in Isaiah. That's the expectation, a general resurrection on the last day. We know that's not what happened in this story, but I get ahead of myself. So I'm going to include here a couple other bits before we finish up on it. So Tom Wright, talking on this specifically, it's worth saying this too, that this was a bodily resurrection. We saw that in Maccabees. And it doubles down here. So everybody knew about ghosts, spirits, visions, hallucinations, and so on. Most people in the ancient world believe in some such things. They were quite clear that this wasn't what they meant by resurrection. This point here is meaningful. While Herod reportedly thought Jesus might be John the Baptist raised from the dead, he didn't think he was a ghost. That's the point. Resurrection meant bodies. We cannot emphasize this too strongly, not the least because much modern writing continues, most misleadingly, to use the word resurrection as a virtual synonym for life after death in the popular sense. Resurrection meant bodies. When Herod thinks that Jesus is John the Baptist back from the dead, he's not saying it's his ghost or his spirit. The thing that shakes him is that it might actually be the body, but he doesn't get this. So resurrection means bodies. That's a really important point. So the summary, resurrection was not an idea that they would have picked up from the surrounding world. I am not no more, I do not care, is not the same as I shall arise. Resugam, that's the epitaph of the Christians. After Jesus, you see that written on many, many tombstones in the early Christian centuries, up through like even the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th century. So resurrection meant bodies alive, not spirits in heaven, and most Jews believed in a single general resurrection. Nobody expected the resurrection of a single person in the middle of history, nor a crucified Messiah, for that matter. All right, so to articulate this point, to drive this home, I'm going to read just a quick section from Surprised by Hope to describe, I guess, this is potentially overkill, but we're going to do it. Tom Wright is talking about people's revisionist positions on resurrection and on the resurrection story, and saying that this is some people believed back then that this resurrection was a spiritual resurrection and not a bodily resurrection. And so he asked at this point, would this make any sense? We can test it out with a little thought experiment. So in AD 70, the Romans conquered Jerusalem. They led back to Rome thousands of captive Jews, including the man they regarded as the leader of the Jewish revolt, the king of the Jews, a man called Simon Bar Giora. He was led into Rome at the back of the triumphal procession, and at the end of the spectacle was Simon being flogged and then killed. Okay, so the Romans got him, just like they get all the messiahs. So now he's saying, let's go through this thought experiment. Let's imagine a few Jewish revolutionaries 3 days or 3 weeks later, and the first one says, I think Simon really was the Messiah, and he still is. The others would be puzzled. Of course he isn't. Romans got him, as they always do. If you want a Messiah, you'd better find another one. Ah, says the first, but I believe he's been raised from the dead. Well, what do you mean, his friends ask. He's dead and buried. Oh, no, I believe he's been exalted to heaven, says the first. The others look puzzled. All the righteous martyrs are with God. Everybody knows that. Their souls are in God's hand. That doesn't mean they've already been raised from the dead. Anyway, the resurrection will happen to us all at the end of time, not to one person in the middle of continuing history. No, replies the first, you don't understand. I've had a strong sense of God's love surrounding me. I felt God forgiving me, forgiving us all. I've had my heart strangely warmed, and what's more, I saw Simon last night. He was there with me. The others interrupt, now angry. We can all have visions. Plenty of people dream about recent dead friends. Sometimes it's very vivid. That doesn't mean they've been raised from the dead. Certainly doesn't mean that one of them is the Messiah. If your heart's been warmed, then sing a psalm for heaven's sake. Don't make wild claims about Simon. That is what they would have said to anyone offering the kind of statement that, according to the revisionists, someone must have come up with as the beginning of the idea of Jesus' resurrection. But the solution isn't incredible, it's impossible. Had anyone said what the revisionists suggest, some such conversation as the above would have ensued. A little bit of disciplined historical imagination is all it takes to blow away enormous piles of so-called historical criticism. I read that whole section just because I think it's such a profound dialogue that a true understanding of the way they thought about resurrection will show that there is no way in which this understanding of some kind of spiritual resurrection is what people were talking about. The understanding of the word resurrection didn't mean ghost, it didn't mean spirit, it didn't mean going to heaven, it meant bodies coming back to life. And nobody believed that happened, except for the Jews, about everybody at the end. So, that summarizes the views on pagan resurrection? The pagan views on resurrection and the Jewish views on resurrection. So next we're going to get into the story of the resurrection of Jesus. And we're going to spend a little bit of time going over why we can believe that a true bodily resurrection happened, not just some sort of spiritual exaltation. So I really hope you join for that. Please subscribe to the channel, and I look forward to keeping my conversation going with you.